Hi everyone, we can see you joining the webinar that is about to commence regarding not another AI governance framework, but we'll just leave it a couple of minutes till people can join. Feel free to shout out and say where you're from. We can see people joining now, which is great. So we would expect to get started in about a minute or so. Thanks all for joining. Oh, great. Oh, greetings from Kuwait. How fantastic. Hi, Salim. Thanks so much for shouting out. Oh,
Austria.
Austria, fantastic. Have we got anyone from Australia though? Because clearly that's of interest to me.
One Australian in the call is enough. I know. Boy.
Mickey, great to see you joining, Mickey. Fantastic. Looking forward to having another chat after this. Great. Well, we'll let everyone to continue joining and great. Thank you for the clapping hands. Fantastic. And thank you all for joining the
Pleasure.
webinar today presented by AIQURIS. And before we get started, I'd like to thank the team that we're working with, 1,000 Steps, who have prepped all of this for us and do a tremendous job. So truly, team, 1,000 Steps, thank you so much. And I see that someone's transcribing the call, so thank you. I hope everyone is happy with that. It wouldn't be an AI session if we weren't using AI in some way to transcribe. So thanks so much. Good afternoon, good morning. There could even be a good evening if we have someone from the States. My name's Helene Main. I'm the Director of Customer Service with AIQURIS. And with me today is our CEO, our co-founder, Dr. Andreas Hauser, and depending how the football or the soccer, if you're Australian, is performing, he may well be German or Austrian. It depends on the performance. So if you've joined us today thinking that you're going to get a 45-minute diatribe of one slide after another, I think you might be disappointed. We're trying not to overwhelm you with slides, but really to lean into having a conversation and learning more about AI governance frameworks and how do we actually go about taking a framework into operationalization. Andreas, help me out. Operationalization.
Operationalization. So, as an Austrian, half German, obviously, that's the only word I can pronounce better than you do, I guess.
Absolutely. It's the
And
word
talking
that we
about
get
slides,
stuck
I'm already
on.
starting with the slideshow. No, a few slides we will share, actually. Thank you.
Fantastic. And there's a lot of questions that we've been asked in our really last 2 years since we started AIQURIS in July 2024. And it's things like, how do we actually know whether an AI system is ready to deploy? What does AI governance look like in practice rather than just in theory? You may well, like me, be quite overwhelmed with the type of AI governance post you're seeing in LinkedIn at the moment. I think on any given day, I see 10 to 20, and it's always a beautiful looking framework, definitely prepared by Claude or even ChatGPT, with lots of lovely images and pictures. But it's how do you actually go ahead and put it into practice? And really, how do we move from principles and policies to making real deployment decisions? So these are some of the topics that we're going to discuss today. But this session is very much for you. As I said, it's not just what we think would work in theory. And to understand where you're joining from today, not just from a country perspective, but certainly from your company perspective, we're going to put up a poll. And we'd love for you to actually complete it. It's really just a click of a button. And then we can get a bit of a view of where you're all from today. So thanks, team. If you can pop that poll up would be great. Brilliant. So there you can see what part of the organisation do you primarily represent, knowing very well that a few of you out there may well be from fellow startups or smaller organisations, and you actually cover quite a lot of roles in your business. So if you could help to answer that, and then we can look at the results in a minute. Let's take a look if we can and see what we've got here. Well, not too surprising. I think a few years ago, we probably would have seen if we asked this question that the majority of the answers would be coming from the IT or the tech department. So it's fairly clear that this is now a much broader conversation. It involves things like your executive leadership that we see there. And of course, risk and compliance, they haven't actually got a rating here, but we certainly know from our more recent conversations that that generally is widely represented. And of course, we see so much of the responses coming from business and operations. And I really think that that's what's important because AI, as we well know, and about putting it into practice and looking at governance isn't just a technology issue. It's very much about organizational decision making. And I think that, Andreas, that's a really good place for us to start with the obvious question. And you've got control of the slide, so if you could pop that one up and let's take a look at it. We really do see at the moment that every time whether we're looking at articles, the news, we're looking at LinkedIn, which I'm sure we all do, that there's yet another framework. But the question really does remain, not just with the framework, but how do we actually deploy the AI system? So it's fairly clear that governance tells us what good looks like, but it actually doesn't tell us if the system is ready to deploy. And really over to you, Andreas, because I know that this is an area that you're quite passionate to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for the intro. And that's exactly the point, right? That we come from different perspectives when we talk about AI governance. And I mean, on a principle level, right? Governance means how you run an organization, right? What are the processes? What are the structures, the authorities? What's also your limitation for acting, doing certain businesses, right? So in principle, that covers everything. When we talk about frameworks, they're ultimately a generalization across AI systems, in this case, AI systems, right? They have to be like this because they should be applicable to any type of deployment, and that's why they are general, right? So they're generally applicable. But the key point here is that these frameworks, they are blind or they don't see the actual deployment. This is a key point, right? A general framework just tells you how should things look like, what you need to do, but it doesn't tell you actually what that means exactly for a specific AI deployment, right? As an example, in a framework, it says, okay, you need to have an accountable person, right? You need a specific process to regularly monitor an AI system, for instance. And it says nicely, do a risk assessment or do make sure that you have lifecycle controls in place, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly those questions you need to answer. And on a framework level, it's just a box you have to tick. But how to do an assessment, right? How to actually implement lifecycle controls. That's where we see the huge gap, right? And we don't lack frameworks and options and best practices, as you mentioned, so many frameworks out there, and they're not good or bad. The challenge is really about how to apply them to specific deployments so that I, as an organization, really know what's the real risk I'm talking to, what are the real requirements to move them from pilot into production.
Understand. So, I mean, really, then it's not about that organizations don't have governance. It's really the fact that the guidance that actually doesn't answer the deployment question. So that's really like the gap I see.
Absolutely. And this we call actually the deployment gap, right? Governance, a proper governance structure is a must. It's not this webinar is also not saying we don't need governance frameworks, right? That's clearly not the message, but it gives you need to implement it as a baseline, right? As a also clear understanding what you need to do, but it doesn't translate to specific deployments, and that's exactly what we call the deployment gap. What we see is currently the big challenge.
Because obviously we're quite aware, as I'm sure, most people on the call are, that not only have you got your internal governance structure or your governance framework, as we're calling it, but you've got the standards that you have to apply or adhere to, the ISO standards. And I'm sure many people have heard about ISO 42001, which is directly related to AI. You've got internal policies. And we're hearing more and more that people are developing their own internal policies or they're looking to buy them or adopt them from elsewhere. So once they've got all of that in place, then they have to think, can we effectively deploy the system? And so, what guidance would you give to companies who have their framework, but then still are a bit concerned about how do I now proceed?
Naja, also first of all, we know this also from IT policies, for instance, right, or general policies. They are only worth the paper when it's actually exercised when it's basically used properly, right?
Mhm.
Also, standards, if you put in place, also if you, for instance, do a ISO 42001, let's stick to this example, or 27001, all these management systems, right? They give you a baseline that tell you roughly what you need to do generally, right?
Mm.
But ultimately, let's stick to this ISO 42001 because that's an often used, let's say, reference standard because that is best practice, right? Worldwide accepted. But there you, when you read through this, there exactly you can realize that's about accountability, about processes, about what you need to do. There's also, for instance, mentioned you do have to do an impact assessment or a risk assessment, right? And coming back to the same conclusion ultimately, so now how, right? I have now these frameworks, I have these standards and policies, but how can I make them actionable? And that's exactly the problem we see. The current governance people, I would call them, yeah, not disrespectfully, GRC governance people, right? They generally currently are considered as stifling innovation, right? Because they come with a rigorous framework, more or less rigorous, with a specific policy, and we come to that later, they don't distinguish whether we talk about a low risk, low impact system using Claude for your presentation or having a heavy, high risk deployment, let's say with a multi-agent system, for instance, right? Migrating legacy systems, whatever it is. So they are not reflecting what you need ultimately um, to have a full, and now make it a bit more complicated, full governance. Governance means actually that you have everything in place, and you also can then, as on the one hand, you have those general requirements, what I mentioned, accountability, transparency, plus you have deployment specific aspects in place as well, right? So these two things have to come together. They cannot live with the other. Also only deployment specific risks is also not enough, right, as an organization, but organizational governance is also not enough. You have to look into both, basically.
I understand. And I think that this is actually quite, or can be quite confusing. And it really doesn't matter at which level of the organization, because we've been fortunate enough to talk to people from all levels of an organization and touching on AI and data and tech and risk. And it can be quite challenging. And I think that this is a really good forum. And to that, I would really like to shout out to people to please do feel that you can put your questions in. We will certainly try to come and answer them as much as we can during the course of the webinar today. And we certainly will be allowing for question time at the end of it. So do feel free. And I really want to do a bit of a shout out here now to Salim, because as you were talking, he was making comments around we've got ethics, regulation, trust, risk, decisions, processes. So it is a lot to think of. But I think it's fair to say that governance really establishes the destination, but you need to have that operationalization, there, I said it, to provide the pathway.
But just to add on here, right? That's exactly also part of the problem that we talk about ethics, yeah, regulation, trust, there is transparency, there's accountability, privacy. So there is actually a lot of specific words, and they all have a certain meaning, and they're all nicely described. They're defined, obviously in standards, ideally, right? But
Mm,
now what, right? You now have to understand what that exactly means for your deployment. And it's exactly, again, coming back again to this deployment gap, that's exactly the challenge. When you think about a standard, right? Because or regulation, a lot of people thought about this with their expertise. They came from their specific expertise. Some have expertise in medical devices, other ones in automated cars or financial sector, right? Wherever they're coming from, they all sit together and generalize their expertise so that this standard is applicable to any AI system. But the problem, what we see is they shift the issue of translating this generalized framework back to the user, back to the deployer, because it's them, it's up to them to make sense out of these standards and frameworks, right? And if you read once the standards, first of all, they're super dry, super boring, and nobody really wants to read that, right? Or frameworks. And which
understand.
clause is now relevant for the specific application? That's not so easy. And this is why companies struggle to make them make policies also actionable, right? Or to make standards really actionable.
So I think with that, whilst we're talking about AI governance frameworks, it would be a nice idea to pop up that second poll, because I think what I'd really love to know is just where people are in their journey. So for those of you, can you really answer the question, does your organization already have an AI governance framework in place? And it's totally understandable that you may not be sure, because for some they're in the process of developing it and may not yet have shared it with everyone. So let's address this poll, and then we can take a look at the answers here. And then I think, Andreas, once we've done that, we can move on to the next slide and elaborate on that one. Fantastic.
So should I go to the next slide already, or?
So I think that's fine. I can see it there up in the background, and I think we're probably in a good position now to look at the response from this latest poll.
That's exciting.
Oh, it's always good, the waiting, still waiting. And I think really
And nothing happens.
we're waiting for the answer is okay. That's actually not surprising at all. I'm not sure how the audience feels about it, or Andreas, how you feel about it, which I will ask in a second. But I think most importantly is whether it's yes, or in this instance, quite a lot for no, it really reinforces this important point, is that having governance, it's no longer the finish line here. The next challenge is really understanding how that governance support the real deployment decisions. And that's what we are going to with the next slide, which I quite like this slide, because as predominantly a non-technical person, I certainly understand it. So let's see how the audience feels.
Yeah, that's why I don't like it so much, because I look more from a technical perspective. But anyway, just on this poll, right? No policy or no framework, and I mean, where this is coming from, what we see when we discuss with organizations, right? Obviously, all are dealing with this topic, no question. But the problem is, it's very hard to understand actually from the variety of tools, AI tools and use cases we are talking about, right? You have hundreds and thousands of employees. Many of them use AI tools for a specific purpose, right? And it's not clear actually, how can I make sure that I set the right governance, right? The right rules, but not to stifle or to prevent people from utilizing and unlocking the power of AI. And this is the challenge, right? This is really, and it's not easy, because the less autonomy you give these systems, the less the risk, or the lower the risk, but the less value you can unlock, right? You give an agent no freedom, it makes no sense, right? But if you give it too much freedom, it can kill your databases, for instance, yeah, just as an example.
Well, I'm sure that there are people on the call who worked in a company similar to that which I did, which was a large consultancy prior to joining AIQURIS. And we all were maybe using AI in the background, but we couldn't use AI actually in the organization because it wasn't allowed. Good to know that that organization has now changed that and formed a larger partnership. But I guess that there's always going to be people in companies, and even if they're highly governed companies or very prescribed as to what you can and can't do, the people are using AI in the background, and they found all ways to get around that. So how does a structure like this, and you've talked about the deployment gap, Andreas, how does that address some of those issues? I think maybe often referred to as shadow AI.
I mean, here this should simply be a visualization of generally the process, how you get to trusted AI, right? You see here standards go in, compliance requirements, obviously regulations, right? Specific risk frameworks, so a whole bunch of documents. And when we look into just the ISO/IEC AI standards, it's already such a big number of documents, very hard to basically understand. And that's exactly the point. How does that come into context? And the context, we come to that later, actually, that determines actually which frameworks, which standards, and what clauses in the policy in these documents are actually then relevant. So first, AI is not good or bad, right? It depends on the context, how it's being used, how it's being deployed. Then you basically go into an understanding of your risk, right? Is it high? Is it low? Is it medium? Also the impact, which stakeholders are concerned, right? And then you start, once you have this understanding, you can then start basically saying, okay, I need specific controls extracted from standards documents and policies, for instance. And then you come to a then you can come to a deployment decision ultimately, right? To understand, is actually, are these requirements in place? Do I meet all of them, or do I have to actually implement further controls? Or do I say, this is also often what we see when you're in an early stage of the AI adoption journey, basically, you may not start with the high risk stuff, right? Let's not push it too hard. Maybe you start with a lower risk application, and then you really can develop that trust with a systematic approach. And we have shown here these 6 domains. There are many ways how to cut this problem, but I think we have to be very much aware that the risk parts or the aspects to consider of AI systems are actually very diverse, very different than from classical IT. Also, security obviously is a topic, right? Adversarial attacks, additional vulnerabilities, right? Second one is legal aspects, right? Compliance with regulation, but also internal, but also, let's say, if there's no AI regulation, complying with existing laws, right? Then you have an ethical aspect, which goes maybe beyond legal obligations, right? You may have a bias, certain discrimination potential here, right? You have a performance issue. If it doesn't deliver the system what it's supposed to deliver, it's not fit for purpose, your customers are not happy and they walk away. You lose a lot of money, right? Then the physical safety. Sorry, physical safety means basically, is that system able to hurt someone physically, right? In a car, for instance, a medical chatbot. And the last one is sustainability. Unfortunately, this goes further down the agenda currently for many reasons, but the logic is don't use a super huge model for a small problem you solve, right? There should be also a balance between carbon footprint and actually the value it delivers, yeah?
The thing that I'm wondering about, and something that I think maybe is quite widely talked about, and certainly at some of those conversations over a beer, and some that we've had with people in offices, not just over a beer, is they'll say, well, that's all very interesting, that's great, but we're using a system that is known to everyone, and I'll go and say Microsoft Copilot. So if I'm using Microsoft Copilot, then I shouldn't have to worry about any of these things because they've obviously got it right. They've obviously tested it. Same with OpenAI or some of any of those large models. And so what would you say to those people? Because that's a challenging conversation, I find.
Yeah, Copilot, all these AI models, they are not good or bad. Again, same story, right? You have to understand how it's being used, how you deploy the system, and that determines the controls. And then you can go deeper, right? When we hear this actually quite often, for instance, with a Copilot, well, it's actually in Azure, it's kind of secure, should be fine, right? The point is that we empower employees and the organization to do much more with a Copilot. Let's stick to the example of a Copilot, right? And that can lead to letting the Copilot send out wrong emails. This is potentially harmless, but also potentially not harmless, or you use it for internal purposes and suddenly you have wrong information because it has access to the wrong data places. You share HR Helene's salary slip with the customer, yeah, is in an extreme case. So basically, it's up to you how to configure and integrate this system. If something goes wrong, you go to Microsoft and say, hey, this didn't work, or there's a massive violation of a specific law. They will definitely say, well, it's your problem because you have not properly integrated the system, right? So that's the thing. Once you are clear which model you take, what's the context, then you can exactly define the controls which are required. Then you can manage the risk.
So we're not really assessing then the model as such. You're really looking at how the model's being used in the workplace and really having to measure against that. Is that right?
Once you have the deployment defined, as the context, right, then you also understand what questions you need to further ask, because maybe you have to go down into the details of that model now, whatever it is. For this specific context, I have to make an accuracy test, or I have to check the hallucination chances, right? Or the robustness of the system. And then you may have to test the model even technically, right? But always in the context. Otherwise, it's meaningless, right?
So this is what you're saying. We go back to the original statement, really. It's not just having a very nice AI governance framework in place. It's really about how you're actually operationalizing it and deploying it and looking at it at an individual use case level, not just on a broad brush view. Exactly. Good. Well, I think that's a nice way that we lead into our audience poll three, because it'll be good just to know from within your organization for you on the call is who in your organization currently approves AI deployment. And it's not necessarily that that would be sitting always with IT. It could come sit elsewhere in the organization, such as risk or legal, etc. So if we can just pop up that poll, I think it'll give us a nice view of where we are with that. Fantastic. And whilst people are just completing that, a bit of a shout out because we're getting some really nice feedback too in the chat, which is great. And one of them, and I like this from Naveed, deploy only when trust is demonstrated continuously, not when compliance is merely documented. The biggest mistake organizations make is treating AI governance of trusted AI as interchangeable. Do you agree with that, Andreas?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely the right way how to look at it. It's not a compliance exercise, right? Again, I think the analogy to compliance is very nice, right? You can comply with a specific document, but
Mm,
it doesn't mean you have no risk in your portfolio, in your organization, right? So I think that's a key point. What is also reflected here somehow this continuous approach, right? You
yeah.
do once a certain assessment and take measures, but you have to continuously monitor basically your risk exposure, right? Things change as well, right? Standards are changing, regulations are changing, but also the way how you use AI is changing, and that means you need to monitor permanently actually these systems, right? So it's not enough to review your policy every 6 months. You ultimately have to make sure you have a permanent overview of this. But I think a compliance analogy is very good, actually. Compliance
Well,
doesn't give you the trustworthiness necessarily. Yeah.
exactly. And I think we're just getting the results here, so we'll be able to see where that does sit in the organization. 37% no defined owner. That really doesn't surprise me either. Yeah, and obviously just 4% a smaller amount sitting with legal. What I think is interesting, or what I wanted to raise with you, is it was actually just last week, and in fact the week prior, that we were both in Australia and in Sydney and Melbourne and my hometown Hobart, I have to say, and it was cold. Is that what we saw down there, even while we were in the country, was that the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese had came out and make a statement about data centres being a big thing in Australia, but they're really looking to address AI safety and develop regulation and standards around AI safety and a trusted AI safety. And it's being talked about everywhere quite widely, globally, of course, but in Australia it was quite significant. I guess what I want to ask is for companies in Australia, for example, who have governance in place, who have a structure that you can follow for like an AI governance framework. When we talk about this continuously monitoring, what would happen if they've actually assessed their risk for their current AI use case? And now there's going to be, say, a standard or a regulation put in place that they have to adhere to. What would be the process that they have to undergo?
And that's the thing, what we have to understand, right? Depending on the deployment context, which also includes the jurisdiction, right? When we stick now to the situation in Australia, or it doesn't matter, Germany or Singapore, there are specific laws and rules which are already in place. Actually, by the way, that doesn't have to be an AI regulation to check whether to have a legal potential risk, right? On the contrary, AI regulation helps you to be very clear what you need to follow. In countries where it's not so explicit, you may run into violations and you're not even aware of it. So,
Okay.
and ultimately, you have to consider obviously these laws or these legal requirements. And if something happens, and this we are asked many times actually by organizations, if something happens, how can you defend basically your decision or your deployment decisions, right?
Mm,
And you have to be able to demonstrate this. And demonstration, um, you don't have to use standards. They're not mandatory, right? Nobody tells you you have to use the standards. So, but on the regulatory requirement level, they are very high level, these requirements, right? Make sure nothing happens, take appropriate measures, and so on and so forth. So if something happens and you base your deployment decisions on standards and best practices and state of the art, right? You have never a zero risk. Always something can happen, but at least you can then demonstrate that you have done everything according to
mm,
state of the art, so that you are minimize the risk, and then you're off the liability. That's actually quite an important aspect, right? Because this liability issue is often considered, particularly in the AI Act right now, right? But also in other jurisdictions, obviously, who is ultimately liable, right? If you demonstrate with an automated car, which has an accident with potential tough consequences, but you
Hmm.
can demonstrate you've done everything, basically. There's a technical rest risk in it, then you are off the liability ultimately, right? And this, I think, has to be also be much more clearer that you need to demonstrate in case something happens, right? You have to defend it.
Well, and I know that this is a question, and it moves us really nicely into the next slide, actually, if you're happy to share that, because we've got four questions here, which we really think that every deployment must answer. I know we talked about the last one there, can we defend our deployment? But I think that these are really relevant questions wherever you're sitting in the organization, whether you're the CEO, the head of risk, the general counsel, or even leading an AI program itself. These are the questions that you really have to know the answer to. And I think I would say it's reasonable to think in some of our conversations, they're not always able to be easily answered. And there's a host of things behind each one of these questions. But can you elaborate on these? Because I think this is quite relevant for our audience today.
Yeah, so we see these four questions are key to make the decision whether you move into production or not, right? Also the first one, obviously, what can go wrong? And it sounds so simple, but it's actually not, right? If your chatbot with a customer hallucinates, for instance, right? What does it exactly, what consequence comes out of this, right? You may have a
Mhm.
frustrated customer, okay, he walks away. You
Yeah.
may also produce wrong answers, right? Or it suggests certain wrong things that leads to a legal obligation, right? There's this old but still famous example of the Canada Airlines. I think they just made decision and then they had some liability or legal obligations, right? So it can go into very different paths. Just taking the example of hallucination, right? So it can be end up as a reputational damage as a Canada Airlines, but also Deloitte, right? That's all in the news
Yeah.
basically, right? Where we see certain wrong behaviors of the system, but also wrong usage of the system. Also one is the failure mode of an AI system. That's hallucination, for instance, right? Or bias. The other one,
Hmm.
I don't have the right oversight in place. The Deloitte is their case, right? They didn't check
Yes.
basically that thing. It's also a simple example, but I think it's very illustrative. But the consequences can be very, very different, right? Also, it can be reputational, can be legal, right? You have a legal issue, but also a financial issue. What I mentioned, if the system doesn't work, right? And operational issues. When you more and
Right.
more depend your or put your operations on AI, and something happens, it disrupts your operation. And I think this is not so easy to understand. What are the hazards, right? What could go wrong? And how does that now go in? What does that mean for my organization, right? What's exactly the harm? And we see this path is quite complex, right? But you need to play this through, right? The risk scenarios, as we talk about, you have to play this through. That's the
Actually, I
first.
want to interrupt you there. Sorry, and that's just typical that I would interrupt. I'm sorry, but when you were talking about how it can affect my organization, I think the other thing that we see, and again, I'll go back to the Australian context here, is that there's this whole issue around your responsibilities as a director. And I don't think this is going to be the first place where this comes in. I think it was Chief Justice Andrew Bell in New South Wales just had given a speech actually stating that as a director, so as on a board, you have accountability and responsibility to make sure that the AI is right,
Yeah.
it's being deployed correctly. So you effectively, as a director, could be impacted, well, not just from a reputational or financial viewpoint, but that there could be significant risks involved.
The interesting one with that is kind of it's a no-brainer to say you are accountable, right? That something goes wrong, obviously you are accountable, right? That's straightforward. But the point is with AI, what does it mean, right? Because without AI, you typically you make decisions based on experts, people who know their stuff, they make certain decisions, right? And you then, as a director, and you're not sure, you can ask, how did you expert come to that conclusion, right? You can ask for explanations. The problem with AI and the LLMs, of course, particularly, it's a black box, whether it's an open source or closed source, it's a black box. And it's not so clear, actually, how this system came to this conclusion, right? And you have to be very clear. You have to ultimately explain it somehow. And this is why, specifically in this instance, right, in New South Wales, they're also saying this cannot be done by a director himself. This must be done by an independent assessor, let's say, right? A specialist who knows how to assess these systems, right?
I'm assuming, we're so fortunate enough to be here in Singapore, where there's a strong view looking at AI. We've got IMDA and their AI Verify Foundation and all of the things that they're looking at. And so I think that we can feel very comfortable in this environment, but these are still things that we have to consider and still look outside for that validation. We always hear about people validating their AI with another AI, but that could be a whole other webinar. We could discuss that. I think it might be a good point, because these questions are quite critical. And as I said, we could elaborate on these quite a bit, but we'll move on. I want to just ask the audience another question is, from your perspective, looking at these 4 questions, and again, thinking about your environment, your organization, which is the question that you think is the hardest to answer? And we're not asking you to give anything away. Obviously, this is all anonymous, but I'd love to hear people's viewpoints, and we can then deep dive in that. So if we could just pop up that next poll would be wonderful. Fantastic. Thank you. Great. And Andreas, if you're happy to maybe just put up the next slide, although we did say we weren't going to inundate people with slides, but we do just have a handful. If you could just pop that up in the back while we're waiting for people to finish this one, and then we can have a look at the results. Because I really think that these 4 questions, and these are the ones that we've been able to drill down in our time with talking to leaders and members of an organization, it's really just after doing this and being able to answer these questions is the next one, and I'll just see if we can bring up our answers here to this poll, is how then, if we've got these questions, how do the organizations answer these questions consistently? And so this is lovely because it brings in Naveed's comment about consistency. How do organizations answer those questions consistently, whether they're looking at one AI system or, as many organizations, 10, 50, 100?
And the interesting part there is when you look into classical risk-based approaches, right? It's very expert driven. One expert goes in, looks at things, has a certain judgment. Another expert has a different judgment, or up to a certain discretion level, right? So this we see already in the classical world. But with AI, it's more complex, right? And there we lack actually a systematic, repeatable, and consistent risk-based approach. And that's what we're talking about. Ultimately, this is all a risk-based approach. It's not about analyzing risks until the cows come home. It's about understanding the risks, and based on the risk, take the right actions, right? So this is the point. So until we get the results, maybe I just quickly go, here we go.
Controlling, haha. Yeah, interesting, isn't it? What is the risk? But I think importantly is, how do we actually control it? And then I think this is really this perfect segue, which is fantastic. Thank you, audience. But if you're able to put up that, you have got that next slide. Thanks, Andreas. Then
the controls, right?
Exactly.
Maybe to elaborate on this briefly here. I don't want to go too much into detail, but we established you need to capture the context, right? That determines everything else downstream, right? So once you have a clear understanding of the purpose, who's using it, who is basically potentially impacted, what are the boundaries for operations, the scope, and so on, right? Then you determine actually the impact, the stakeholders who could be impacted, right? Your employees, customers, third parties, and so on. And then you assess actually the real risk of the deployment, right? And there exactly comes into the picture, not risk. What does it mean, right? It means you understand the hazards, what I mentioned, failure modes, hallucination-like, but misuse, for instance, And what does that mean? How does that lead into a consequence, right? This is the
Mm.
impact. And then let's say you have a probability that this will happen, right? And this is then ultimately the risk. It's also a science on its own. I have to be also honest. It's not that straightforward, particularly applying it to AI. But now establishing control, right? How do we do this then? So once you have an understanding of your risk, you know what's relevant. Example, you have, I mentioned this previously, physical safety is maybe an easy example. You have a car, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
right? Automated or fully autonomous. And there is a physical safety risk involved. Naturally, you have to look into physical safety standards, physical safety documents, right? That's the logic how a risk-based approach works. So once you understand what risks are you looking at, you can identify the right frameworks, the right standards, the right documents or requirements, right? And this leads actually to probably a list of a number of documents. And then
Right.
these documents cover actually specifically this risk. Once you understand, and the other challenge is to read these documents and know exactly what's relevant. Okay, that's another little challenge. But once you have the risk profile, you then have the list of controls. You then have to see how far my organization meets those controls. And then you know exactly my residual risk. That's my real risk exposure. And then you know, do I have a gap I have to fill? Maybe I have to do a certain test or I need to monitor over time, whatever it is, right? And then you
Mm-hmm.
have full assurance. That means you can move into deployment with confidence. That's what we always say. With confidence means you know exactly what you're doing. And we saw this also in the chat, right? Maintaining it means continuously monitoring the context. This is the key. Also, you're monitoring the context, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not monitoring, as first, does the context change? And then on the control side, basically, do certain standards change or requirements? But they all go back into the context. If something in the context is changing, you then have to do a reassessment, and then you know, does this change, whatever regulation, use, or whatever, affect my actual risk exposure as an organization? And then you may have to add additional controls, and then you are on the safe side.
There's so much for organisations to consider and how they go about doing this. And I want to say thanks to Mike Abbott, who just mentioned, he was actually very pleased that we mentioned data on this slide around the capturing the context, because as he said, it's one of the most commonly overlooked items when
And maybe, sorry to interrupt, but maybe to add, because what I didn't mention with these controls, what type of controls we're looking at, right?
yeah.
That's here important, I think, to highlight because we talk about governance. There are certain governance controls, there are
Mm-hmm.
certain process controls, but there are also certain technical controls for the AI system and for the
Mm.
data, right? You need to understand what are the quality requirements for the data, for instance, for training, but also when I in the inference state, right? When I use it, what goes in, and does it meet the quality requirements, right? And there obviously data is a key element. But what I think is important here, you have very different types of requirements or controls. And there you see also in an organization, they sit in different departments. A
Yeah,
governance
exactly.
requirement sits in the governance department if they have one, right? The process also potentially in the governance, but more on the process side, right? People who are
Mm.
more considered about processes. And the technical requirements sit typically with the deployment owner, right? They run the system, they want to know what are specifically technical requirements and so on. So you see suddenly you have three layers of controls and you have to bring all of these stakeholders together so that they pull in one direction and one is not blocking the other, which we actually see right now, right? Because they all come from very different angles.
Absolutely. And I think that was one of the things we talked about in the beginning is it's very hard for those that are looking after AI governance and whatever they're called within the organization, depending on the size, is in our conversations, and one I can reflect on more recently with someone from a bank, a senior member at a bank, said that they see themselves as being there to support their stakeholders and the individuals running the large business units. But the business units see them as just being difficult and challenging and limiting them and putting up too many guardrails and not engaging with them. So it really makes their role very challenging. And so that's something I guess we will see changing in time to come. But, did you want to comment on that? Because I know that you speak to these, to people as well who are sharing this, how they're addressing that challenge.
Yeah, that's exactly the issue, that there are different, let's say, stakeholders in the organization. You mentioned that governance people are considered stifling innovation, and I mean,
Yeah.
but what I mentioned with the different controls and the different functions, right? The issue is also a governance person, and no offense, right? They typically don't know the details of a technical requirement.
Mm,
The other way, the deployer of the system, they want to just make this work, right? They just look into the performance, into the accuracy, whatever, right? But they also don't really appreciate that there's a governance requirement, right? There are certain guardrails or safeguards, depending, right, which you
mm,
need to consider. And this is the issue and the friction we see. And there's, in what our experience is when we speak to organizations, it takes them very long to get this alignment. 3,
yeah.
6, 9 months, right? All these different parties sit together, compliance, governance, an AI expert, the business unit deployment owner. Also, they sit 5, 6 people together at least, right? And this is all new to them. Let's face it, right? AI is not really in everyone's understanding, actually, right? So it's all new. And when it comes to risk and specifically how to deal with this, that's even less clear, right? So and there I see that it must be very clear what is the responsibility for a governance person, what's for a legal person, and what's actually for IT, of course, and for the deployer, right? And you have to figure that ultimately out. And this can only work when you have a very structured approach, and just have a static framework, as we said at the beginning, that actually doesn't work, because it may be an overkill for some applications and it won't be
Absolutely.
sufficient for high-risk applications, for instance.
Well, I think that moves us again nicely on to the next slide that we have, and where we're saying that we need something to be repeatable, or it needs to be a repeatable process. I think this is a good one, and we wanted to share it and to show people how even within an organization with a good governance structure, framework, etc., that you can have one AI system, but depending on where you're deploying it, it's going to be different deployment decisions. And so I think that this one is, we've got the same AI system being deployed, same model, same capabilities, as you can see, one's Singapore, one's Germany. So then why wouldn't the deployment decision be exactly the same?
Also here, I think obviously the focus is on the jurisdiction, right? Only. So you exactly have the same system, same context, same organization, but in 2 different jurisdictions. And then you obviously have to deal with different laws and regulations.
Yes, yeah.
And this turns out to be a huge challenge. But before I further elaborate, this is just one example, right? Because you can have in an organization the same model, exactly the same technology, but very different applications, right? And there, the difference is much more significant than only on a regulatory side, right? Also, just to highlight this. In this case, we wanted just to make it a bit illustrative, only about the regulations, and ultimately complying with certain laws. And this we see is actually, we have one example, translation tool. Very simple, right? You used LLMs and they're good at translation, obviously. It was actually German English. The problem is that they run this system in different jurisdictions, in Germany, Europe, and in Singapore and Asia. So how do we make sure it's GDPR compliant, right? It's
Mm,
actually not so simple suddenly, because where does the data sit? It has to sit potentially only in Europe, right? Or, I mean, there's a trade agreement between Singapore and Germany, so that makes it easier. But in principle, that's exactly these challenges. And even with simple examples, you end up in a potentially complicated situation. And now think about a car that has an AI component and you want to sell this globally, or machine or product, whatever it is. You run suddenly through many jurisdictions and they all have different requirements, right? Whether we are in Singapore, Europe, US is even worse, because there you have, on the different state level, you have different requirements. So it's a very messy landscape, and to
mm.
navigate through it makes it quite complex. And that's why we see that this is manually very hard to manage. And that's why we talk always about operationalization, because there's also an automation aspect in it, because you simply can't do this anymore manually. That's just impossible, right?
And I think this is a good time actually, because I know that probably people are already starting to think of their questions, and we've got just 7 minutes or so left in our time together today. So would love it for those of you that have got questions, if you're happy to pop it into the chat. And by all means, if you'd like to have a discussion outside of this chat, we're certainly able to be contacted, and we'll share the details towards the end. And Andreas, before we can discuss this slide certainly quite a lot, because I could ask a whole host of questions, but I want to move on to what I think is probably your favorite image, and that is really when we're talking about AI. It's not just about the risk isn't in the AI, it really is how you deploy it. If you can touch on briefly, if you don't mind, and then we'll move to the next slide, about these various pillars, about how the AI system really can present different risks depending on its use, its operating environment, and the deployment context, such as the country, as you highlighted.
And I mean, I touched base on this a little bit previously, but here we see it then how that can really look like, right? And that's why such a structure makes a lot of sense, because you can do different things, right? First of all, it gives you an understanding of the spectrum of risks, right? Where do they sit actually, right? In which area do they sit? What does it also help you is bringing in the right functions, people in your organization, right? Obviously, if you have a legal issue, you have to bring in the compliance and legal people, right? For instance, the security, obviously, cybersecurity, right? Performance is then the deployment owner typically, right? Safety, sustainability. So you can nicely see the spectrum where this risk sits, and you can then bring in these stakeholders. And this, I think, is really a very helpful approach. And I mean, I don't know exactly what that example is now, but it doesn't matter. In certain applications, it may be no safety risks. There may be also no sustainability risk, right? Or a legal risk may be also not relevant. If you have an internal tool, right, you may not have any legal compliance issues, or with regulation particularly, no, right? It depends very much, again, on the context. And these risk spectrums, or this risk distribution, if you will, across these 6 domains, are very different depending on the context. Coming again back, right? It depends really ultimately on the context. Yeah, maybe that's...
So basically, if something, a use case showed up, and this was the results essentially across these pillars, if you like. So if someone actually asked you, is this AI system high risk? I'm assuming your answer would be like, tell me how you're using it, because only then, when you talk about context, can you truly understand.
We have to also differentiate high risk,
Mm-hmm.
low risk, and so on. What does that mean? Also, we have the AI Act with this classification, right? And their classification follows purely the regulatory logic, fundamental rights, right? And so on. It does not look into your business risk. So you may have a low risk system in the AI Act, according to the AI Act, but a high risk system for your organization. So just don't mix that up, right? It's not the logic only following compliance, right? It gives you the full picture, because again, you can be very compliant, but for your business, it's a high risk system, right? So, and with this, you can say, yes, there are significant risks, obviously, in this use case, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you could not deploy this, obviously, right? You cannot deploy this just without thinking about what are the controls. And the challenge or the task is now, when you have this risk profile, then you understand what controls, which we touched base before, right? What specific controls you need to look at. And then you shrink this risk profile, move it from the red to the green, and then you are ready to deploy. So you have a very clear understanding when you can deploy and when not. And just one comment on, because this we hear often, what is red? Meaning, what is green? What does that mean, right? So
Exactly.
red, simply it's super risk. It's very high risk. It's not acceptable. What is acceptable depends on your organization, right? A smaller company may not accept a loss of $100,000, whereas a big financial institution doesn't care too much about 100,000, right? So you have to understand your risk appetite and accordingly, exactly what is red, what does that exactly mean? And then you can clearly say, as long as it's amber or red or orange, I can't accept it. As soon as it's green or light green, I can accept it.
Okay.
It's a very clear deployment decision. Yeah?
Well, I mean, I think that that's one of the big takeaways from this session today, as I realize we're heading towards concluding our time together, is the big takeaway really is that the risk isn't determined by the model, is really determined by that deployment. And that brings us, if I may, to our final slide, because we've really talked about governance today, we've talked about operationalization, said it finally, and we've talked about understanding the deployment risk. And this is understanding now about how much assurance is enough. And I know we've got a very short time, Andreas, if you could just briefly walk us through this slide
Yeah.
before our
I just
guest
see
takes
we are
off.
running out of time. I mentioned this somehow. Uh, really think about what impact does it have, and then lightweight controls are good enough. The higher the risk, the more rigorous you have to go about with risk controls. And what it shows also here, sorry to repeat, but this is about frameworks as well. You see here nicely that a static framework just doesn't work, right? It's not enough. Either it's overkill or it doesn't cut it.
Well, I might ask you to pop up the last slide, which actually just shows the QR code for those. Or this one, no, not the last slide. Yes, thank you. That those guests can get some more details and to speak to us directly. We'd love to hear from you. But we really want to thank you so much and for the great feedback. And we haven't really had that many questions come in, and I probably didn't leave enough time for questions. And for that, I'm sorry. But I think importantly today, we really have seen that it's about confidence. You know, those in our audience and our organizations have the confidence to be able to deploy, the confidence that you've understood the deployment, you've identified the relevant risks, you've put the right controls in place. We talked a lot about controls and confidence so you actually can explain and defend the decision that you've made. And I'll just hand to you, Andreas, for the final comments and thank our audience for today.
I just say thank you very much for the questions and the audience. So always happy to continue a conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.